Well, hey, once again, I want to welcome you as we are in week 4, maybe a better said bonus time of a series we've been in that we've been calling Ducks in a Row. And it's a series that, while the topic of money and generosity has been a talking point throughout, really the point of this talk and series is actually priorities. It's actually priorities. In fact, this is really the heart of why we find Jesus actually talking as much about money and finances in the Bible as much as he does. And it's not because God cares about our money, but it's because God cares about you. And we see this actually in Jesus' own words in Matthew 6, when he says, starting in verse 31, it says, "So do not worry, saying, oh, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the pagans, they run after these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first. Seek first his kingdom, his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well." In other words, I know you think that behind so much of the anxiety and the stress that so many of us can feel when it comes to our finances, when it comes to our bills, maybe even when it comes to that job, that somehow it's a money problem. But I'm telling you, it's actually a priorities problem. Where when we learn to actually seek him first, we learn to put him first, we learn to pray first, notice what it goes on to say. And all these things will be given to you as well. Because it's only when he's first in our life can he begin to work on everything else in our life. And so in the first 2 weeks, we looked at how generosity helps to get our lives in the right order for God to work, not just in our life, but actually on our hearts. Because without the right heart, don't be surprised when what you once saw as a blessing now feels more like a curse. Because it's impossible, catch this, it's impossible to see a blessing as a blessing through the filter of a bitter heart, a resentful heart, a selfish heart. And so we talked about God's treatment plan actually for finding healing and renewal when it comes to our heart for God and for others through generosity. And then last week we shifted from focusing on how we see God's hand of blessing at work through what we do with the first 10% in relation to tithes and offerings to talking about how we handle the other 90%. The other 90%, as truth is, and the numbers would back this up, but most Americans who struggle financially, in fact, 80% according to the most research studies on this, what they came to find isn't that we have an income problem, as much as many of us have a spending problem. That behind the challenge so many of us have when it comes to really getting a handle on our finances, getting a handle on our money, it's less about the struggle to manage our money as much as it has to do with managing ourselves. And which brings us to today. As look, I want to speak not so much to the 80% from last week, but to the 20%. Who still, even after all that we've been preaching on, talking about for these past several weeks, still feel like what they have is not enough. By looking at this biblical principle known as stewardship. This principle that, mind you, isn't about making more of what we don't have as much as about making the most of what we do have. And look, if that doesn't sound maybe that exciting or engaging or maybe it fails to pique your interest, hopefully the title for this message will. As look, this weekend I felt led to talk about how to increase our net worth. How to increase our net worth by again, gaining a biblical understanding of how stewardship works. Through this parable, really this story Jesus shares, where on the heels of talking about his eventual return and his second coming in Matthew 24, we see this call in Matthew 25 to actually make the most of the time we have left. But by going on to share what is commonly referred to as the parable of the talents. Let's take a look at this. In Matthew 25, starting in verse 14, it says, "It will be like a man going on a journey, who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability." Now that word talent might not be maybe what you think it is. As the word talent in biblical time was actually a measurement of money, specifically in reference to weight. In fact, that's why in the UK and Britain, their currency is referred to as a pound, because originally it was a word, it was a term, it was a measurement that was connected to weight. And so a talent in particular in biblical times was actually the largest form of financial measurement available. Now keep in mind, in the first century, this was far from an exact science, as a talent was something that typically ranged between 75 to 125 pounds, and it was based on the average weight a man could carry. This is why trying to get the exact amount that's being referred to in the story is actually really hard to know, because obviously the amount of a person can carry varies depending on the person that we're talking about. But that said, while we don't know exactly how much this talent that Jesus makes reference to in the story is, what we do know for a fact is that it was a lot. It was a lot. Because a talent wasn't, again, just a measurement of weight. It was their way of measuring out gold and silver. So think about this. If the weight of a talent of gold ranged between 75 to 125 pounds, listen, if we put that in today's currency ratio for just a second, where the value of gold today is somewhere around $2,000 an ounce, and we have 16 ounces in a pound, and there are 75 pounds of gold for the lowest measurement of a talent. Catch this. Here's what that means. That means that the person who received one talent by today's estimations would have received just short of $2.5 million. $2.5 million. And again, that's on the low end. As look, I know it can be easy to read the story at first glance and feel bad for the guy who only got one. Like it seems so unfair. It seems like he got cheated out of something, like this poor guy. He just got one talent. But again, this is a guy who got almost $2.5 million. That would be like feeling bad for the person who won the lottery one time. Like poor guy was only able to win the Powerball Mega Millions once. See, here's the point I'm trying to get at. Listen, don't undervalue what God gave you. Don't undervalue what God gave you. It might just be one talent, but I'm telling you, there's a lot of worth and value hidden in that one talent. As look, I wonder how many of us are tempted to put limits on what we can do or not do in this life, because when we look at what we have, it's easy to just see it as, well, I've just got this one skill. I've just got this one talent. I've just got this one, kind of thing that I feel like I'm good at. That at first maybe doesn't look like or seem like much to us. Again, maybe it's this ability you have for photography, or it's this ability you have to carry a conversation. And because it seems like all we got is this one thing that we're good at, it's easy to discount all the things that one thing can actually lead to. And yet what I love about this story of stewardship that Jesus tells, it reminds us that when we quit complaining and focusing on what we don't have and begin to focus on actually investing the time and the effort into what we do have, the skills we do have, the talent we do have, the time we do have, what we come to discover is the unlimited potential and the very thing we thought once was the limit on our life. In fact, it might help to explain why Paul says what he does. As on the heels of sharing his story of how God had done a work in his life, goes on to say this in Philippians 3. But I focus on this one thing. On this one thing. Forgetting the past and looking forward to what lies ahead, I press on to reach the end of the race and receive the heavenly prize for which God, through Christ Jesus, is calling us. As I love how Paul speaks into something that I think, especially speaking of undervaluing what God has given us in terms of making a kingdom impact and experiencing really true net worth in this life, is the story of God's work in our lives. Where if we're honest, because maybe we don't feel like our story is that dramatic or that life-changing. It can be easy to sit there and think, man, does this count it as even worth sharing? But can I encourage you? Listen, if you have Jesus in your life, you need to know that you have a story worth telling. 1 John 5:10 puts it this way: those who believe in the Son of God have the testimony of God in them. Again, if you got Jesus, you can trust there's a testimony in you. There's a story that only you have of God's amazing grace at work in your life that wasn't meant to stay with only you. And listen, I get sometimes the hesitation around this. And I think maybe some of that hesitation is kind of rooted, especially if you grew up in church. Anyone remember like testimony night, right? Or testimony Sunday? Typically it was the weekend. The pastor really didn't want to preach. And of course, what would happen oftentimes? So somebody would get up there, some sweet grandma would get up there and start sharing their story that, let's be honest, oftentimes sounded like they were sharing an episode from Breaking Bad, right? They start talking about back when I was working for the mob and stealing cars and running over the neighbor's dog just because I could. But then I met Jesus, right? And it's like suddenly the story would turn like they're now a preacher or they're running an orphanage in South Sudan somewhere. And I'd hear this. And I remember thinking to myself, like this is a lot, this is intense. And so when the opportunity came to share my story to, at church or with a friend to give my testimony, I remember looking at my story and thinking, what I had to share seemed so small and insignificant in comparison. As don't get me wrong, definitely, I've made more than a few wrong turns in my life and bad decisions. I've gone through my prodigal years in life like a lot of people have. But if I'm being honest, for the most part, I've had it pretty good. I grew up in church. I grew up with parents who are an amazing example of what it is to walk out this faith in Jesus. I grew up having a relationship with Jesus at a very early age, where even when I went through struggles and challenges in life, I learned early on that my worst day with Him is so much better than my best day without Him. And yet, can I tell you, if that's you, you need to know that kind of story matters. The stories of what God saved you from are just as powerful as the stories of what God saved you out of. The heartbreak maybe He saved you from, the lost years He saved you from, the regrets He saved you from. Come on, how many know that's a good testimony to have? That's a good story. That's a story worth sharing. Because listen, while people can argue with your theology, how many know they can't argue with your testimony? It's why when the Bible talks about sharing our faith, oftentimes it uses this term not in relation to evangelism or passing out some gospel Bible tract, but it uses this term of simply being a witness. Just sharing your story of how you've seen God work and move in your life. So that through your story, someone will be reminded that if God can do it for them, I got to believe that God could do it for me. See, again, I'm just trying to encourage you to not undervalue or discount what God has given you. Whether it's your story, whether it's your time, whether it's your talents. Let me ask you, what have you discounted that God is counting on to make a kingdom impact in this world? What have you discounted that God is counting on to make a kingdom impact in this world? Because I'm telling you, especially if we hope to increase our net worth in terms of making a kingdom impact in this world, we got to understand that little doesn't mean less. Little doesn't mean less. There's this account in Mark 12 where this lady is giving an offering to God. And she tosses in these 2 mites, basically the equivalent of 2 pennies into the offering. And now, interesting enough, when people would give an offering or they would give their tithe, back in first century biblical times, they would oftentimes have these big bronze basins. in which the people would toss their offering into, that depending on how much you tossed in would determine the noise that it made. And as a result, like giving and offering time had become kind of a show. With the bigger the gift, the louder the noise, the greater the applause and attention they oftentimes got from the religious of the day. And so Jesus, he's watching this. He's observing this. Well, when he notices a woman whose offering seems to go unnoticed and uncelebrated by others, as what Jesus hears hitting this bronze basin couldn't have been more than maybe a couple pennies. And yet, while this woman's offering and giving seemed to go uncelebrated by the religious, we come to find it celebrated by our God. As Jesus actually draws the attention of the disciples to her, saying this in verse 33. So calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others." And you know why? Because she didn't have a lot. She didn't have a lot. As what Jesus was trying to get the disciples to see is because God, the value of something isn't determined by how much of something you have, but in how much of that something you have left. As let's be real, sometimes we'll look at God and we'll be frustrated because like the disciples and the religious today, we're often impressed by big gifts, if we're being real. And so sometimes we look at God and we'll look at what others have that maybe we don't have in comparison, and we'll be like, where's the big gifts, God, for me? Like I've seen you do big things and deliver in big ways in their life. Like where's my child, right? Where's my answer to this big audacious prayer I've been praying for? Where's the business success? Where's my winning lottery ticket? And look, you guys understand, God, though, doesn't ascribe value to things in the same way that we do. Seeing value not in simply giving us things that He's plenty of, but seeing value in giving us something that He doesn't have much of. Let me put it another way. For God to give you $1 million, while it might mean a lot to you, truth is, it wouldn't mean much to Him. You know why? Because He owns it all. He owns all the silver and the gold and the cattle on 1,000 hills. So giving you $1 million is like you owning the ocean and giving somebody a drop of water. Are you following me? So the only way God can show you how much He loves you was not by giving you a little bit of a lot of things that He has, but by giving you the only thing in all creation that He has only one of. And we find it in whether you've been around church or much at all, a verse almost all of us know and have memorized at heart, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that He gave what? His one and only Son, that whoever believes in Him will not perish but have eternal life. And again, how many of us, we can, if we're not careful, take it for granted because it seems so little. Not realizing in this gift of His one and only Son, we find everything we need through a relationship with Him. Not just to experience life eternal, but everything we need to experience life abundance. Or to put it another way, to make the most out of this one and only life He's given us. When I quit chasing after what I feel like I don't have out there and instead invest in making the most of what I already do have in Him. As why did the other guys get more? Going back to this story, the parable of the talents. Why did the other guys get more? Like why did that guy get 2 and that guy get 5, leaving the other guy with just 1? Well, I think we find the answer in verse 15. He says, to the one He gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. To his ability. In other words, what determined that they got was God's grace. But what determined what they got was their ability. See, stick with me on this. Interesting enough that word for ability in the Greek is this word dynamos. And dynamos, when it's used in the same sense as God, means supernatural power. But when dynamos is used in the same sense as man, catch this, it means strength. Now here's why this distinction matters, because you have to remember that a talent is defined by, and again, it's based upon how much a person can carry. So why did the master in the story give one guy 5 talents? Because he knew he could handle and carry what would have been equivalent to his own weight and then some. Which again, I think helps explain why the other guys got what they got. As why did the one guy just get 1 talent? It's because the master knew that person, you got to get this, catch this, would have been buried by their blessing. Without the character to sustain it, without the maturity to handle it, without the resilience to carry it through. See, what's interesting about this story isn't so much the details that were given, but the details that were not. As we see the master in this parable and determining who got what, it presupposes strength. Or you could say it another way, that the guy who had 5 had an unfair advantage over the rest. As look, I don't think it was by accident that the details of how each of them got the strength that they had to carry what they got are hidden from us. Because listen, truth is, it's always resilience I find in the hidden seasons and hidden places of life that I find God most uses to prepare us, to build us, and ultimately to strengthen us. I mean, think about it this way. Like I think of King David, who got his big break remember when he took down Goliath? Where in this moment, everybody came to realize, man, David could sling a stone like nobody's business. But let's not forget that before he was knocking out giants, look what he was doing when nobody was around. Let's check this out. In 1 Samuel 17 here, King Saul, he's asking for volunteers to fight. To fight Goliath, that this giant that no one else seemed willing to take on. Only to see this one little hand raised in the back, way in the back of the crowd. And I can only imagine that when he saw who was holding up that hand, this tiny, scrawny shepherd boy volunteering. I'm sure Saul was like, it's kind of like that kid in the classroom who's always raising his hand wanting to answer. I'm sure he was like that teacher, just kind of looking for anybody, anyone else than that kid raising their hand to call on, right? Like anybody else want to volunteer to take on Goliath and only to finally realize, listen, he's in a place where no one else wanted to volunteer, finally realizing it's David or nothing. And so he asks him. He asks David, he calls David to come forward. He's like, hey, you're just a kid. Like, how do you think you're going to take down a giant? A trained warrior like Goliath. And take a look at David's response. But David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it. I struck it and I rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair. I struck it and killed it. Then I love this. David starts to kind of go all Conor McGregor on him. With some serious biblical trash talk. Like, I don't know about you, but I love some good biblical trash talking. And you're going to see it right here in verse 36. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he's defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. Did you hear? Did you hear where David's confidence came from? His boldness came from? His audacity came from? He goes, look, I don't mind doing it in front of tens of thousands because I was doing it for years in front of no one but God. And I did it over and over and over again because I knew that being resilient through anonymity was actually preparing me for the destiny that God had planned for me. Or I think of Jesus, who for 18 years, we don't hear anything about him. Like we hear about him when he's 12. When we read in the gospel accounts of his parents somehow losing track of him in Jerusalem, finally chasing him down and finding him hanging out at church. And when his mom, Mary, asked him, hey, where have you been? We've been so worried about you. We've been looking for you. Jesus' only response to her is, woman, didn't you know that I would be here about my Father's business? Now, not sure, but I don't think it's coincidence that we don't hear about him for another 18 years. like something happened, and it was more than just mom grounding him. But what was actually happening was God the Father doing in Jesus' life, how he's working and preparing him in those 18 years in anonymity. Preparing him. Or I think of Moses, who spent 40 years in the desert leading sheep. Why? Because God knew he was going to have to spend 40 years leading people in the desert. See, here's what I'm trying to get us to see, that in those times and seasons where maybe we feel forgotten or maybe we feel overlooked, listen, can I encourage you that just because something is invisible doesn't mean it isn't valuable. And it's so important we get this, especially when it comes to stewardship and making the most of the time we have, the dream we have, the talent we have. Because if I can get extremely practical with this, the truth is, if say you hope to maybe be like, your dream is to become an accomplished songwriter, how many know you better be prepared to write 1,000 songs before any one of them get airtime? Or maybe your dream is to eventually be recognized as an accomplished chef. Be prepared to learn 1,000 recipes before you win 1 Michelin star. You know, my wife, she's been recently really getting into candle making. And she's gone all out. Like, she's got all the equipment, and she's started to make candle after candle. And I remember when she was kind of getting this set up, doing some research on really what it takes to build and start and grow a successful candle making business. One of the things that really caught her attention, really caught my attention, is they said that you had to be prepared to give away 80 candles for free before ever attempting to sell one. Because again, it's that hidden time, it's that seemingly meaningless time, or maybe even wasted time, that actually is the most valuable in terms of preparing us and strengthening us and building us up for what God has for us. And look, I get the pushback with this. Like, Pastor, that's great. Like, if you know what that thing is for you. But what do you do? Like, what do I do if I don't really know what my thing is? Like, my struggle isn't so much in other people recognizing some hidden potential or skill in me, but the struggle is in seeing and recognizing it in myself. And look, if that's you, can I help you out with this? As how do we make the most of what we have when we don't know what we have? It's by making the most of the opportunities we have now. Investing in the job you have now. Investing in the relationships you have now. Investing in the time you have right now. Because I'm telling you, it's in the hidden spaces and even in the hard to see places of life where maybe it's hard to see the purpose, it's hard to see the value, it's hard to see the significance in it, that God grows the roots. We need, I find, to stand up to the public doubt, the public failures, the public criticism that I'm telling you will come as those roots begin to bear fruit. John Maxwell, he's an author and a speaker who really focuses on ways to really grow as a leader. And he's written, of course, countless books around this topic, with the most recent being a book that I love. And the book is simply called Good Leaders Ask Great Questions. Because John Maxwell, for all his writing and study on what really makes a great leader, whether leading a business or leading a church or leading your family, has found over the years that especially what separates the good leaders from the great ones is not that they have all the right answers, but rather the humility and teachability to ask the right questions. Even when asking those questions meant getting an answer and feedback they didn't maybe always want to hear. In fact, I like how Proverbs 13:18 speaks. It says, if you ignore criticism, you will end in poverty and disgrace. But if you accept correction, you'll be honored. You'll grow. You'll be lifted up. I remember back in our Vancouver days, I went through sort of this fitness kick, and we had a a 24-hour fitness near us, and so I was doing some incline bench presses, and whenever I did these bench presses, when I get done, like I felt like this shoulder pain, right? That would just nag at me through the whole week, and it seemed like the more I did them, I thought it would get better, but just seemed like it kept getting worse. And so one of these days, like I'm doing this incline bench press, and again the shoulder pain is still there when this guy, he comes over, and I don't know him. Like, I've never met this guy before. Like, he's huge. He's, looks like a bodybuilder of a guy. And he doesn't say hi. He doesn't say, hey, let me introduce myself. He just simply says, looks at me, and he kind of stands over me. He's like, why do you do them like that? And I was like what? He goes, your arms, like they're really flared out. Like your elbow should be a little more tucked in, or else you're going to hurt your shoulder. And as I was like, okay, so I brought my shoulders in and actually started doing them that way. And wouldn't you know it, that pain that was nagging at me for so long went away. Now let me tell you something. It hurt to receive that feedback in that moment. Because number one, I remember thinking, like, who asked you to begin with? Right? Like nobody ever said, hey, man, hey, can you help me out with this? Or you got any ideas of how I can improve and do these in a way that doesn't cause so much pain? No, he just looked over at me, and somewhere along the way, like, he thought to himself, my contribution to this gym and to this world is going to be helping that guy who obviously does not know what he's doing get better. And not only that, he didn't even use the usual compliment sandwich in bringing it up. You know what I'm talking about? He didn't come over, say something nice. Like, hey, I've noticed you're working really hard at this, and then correct me, like here's how you actually do it, only to follow it up with something nice again, like, hey, keep at it, way to go. No, it's just like, what are you doing? Looks at me, tells me the way to do it, and then walks off. Because listen, in saying that, listen, here's why I bring this up. While it hurt, though, to receive feedback, how many know it would have hurt even more if I didn't listen? Look, especially if you hope to grow and increase, make the most of what God has given you. Listen, you need to know that not every critic is a hater. And to be clear, not talking about letting them speak into your character, because who you are, that's already established, and that's defined by what God says about you, not what other people think about you. But if we hope to really lean into this principle of stewardship and making the most of what we have, the time we have, the talent we have, the ability we have, we got to be willing to handle the occasional feedback, even when it's not maybe what we want to hear. Like if you're a business owner, you need to know that not every negative Google review is crazy. Like you got mold in your peach cobbler. You might want to fix that. Maybe address that by simply listening to your customers a little more. And look, when we talk about teachability, look, you need to know I'm not just talking about the willingness to learn through feedback, but also the willingness to learn through setbacks. And in fact, maybe nowhere in Scripture do we see this more than the story of a guy by the name of Joseph that we find in Genesis. Remember Joseph's story? The kid with the coat of many colors who has this amazing dream that he's going to go on and do some great things, some big things. But his brothers kind of been seeing that, rather than being excited for him, rather than cheering him on, feel threatened by him. Feel jealous by him. And of course, it doesn't help when his dad shows this incredible favoritism towards him. As here he is walking around his Versace jackets and driving around his brand new camel or car, whatever they had back then. While his brothers are living on the hand-me-downs, right? Driving the old beat-up Chevy Trailblazer. Getting the hand-me-down clothes. And so the brothers, they come up with this plan. They start imagining what their life would be like without him. And they come up with this big plan and plot to do away with him, to get rid of him, ultimately beating him up, ultimately settling just short of killing him and taking him out. They decide to actually make a little profit off him by selling him into slavery to a caravan of Ishmaelites. And of course, as the story kind of goes on, it just seems like with every setback, he's getting further and further away from that dream over the course of these 13 years. 13 years between when he had the dream to ultimately becoming second in command, with only the Pharaoh in a position even higher than him. And again, I love his perspective, because the interesting thing is all these setbacks, which would have been so easy for him to complain about, so easy for him to get frustrated about, never once, interesting enough, in the entire story of Joseph, do we see him complain? Do we see him go, oh, woe is me? Do we see him just living in the regret, or living in the bitterness, or living in the discouragements? In fact, not only does he not live in it, we actually see him choosing to learn from it. Again, what I love about Joseph is he didn't live in it, he chose to learn from it. I put in my notes this way, and that's that what we find through Joseph's story is someone who understood the importance of never letting what time took take away what time gave. Because think about it. Like when you look back at all the setbacks that would only ultimately set him up for the dream to come to fruition. I mean, think about this. How best to learn how to manage an organization and finances and drama that would come than time in Potiphar's house? Or how do you think he learned to have a heart and a compassion for those who feel hopeless and stuck? Time in prison. Or how do you think he would have learned to depend on God, trusting God, if not for that pitfall early on in his life? Again, setback after setback, that because he chose to learn from and not live in, served as a setup for the dream God gave him to come to fruition. As look, just in case you were never good at maybe the wheel of fortune, what was the unfair advantage that God gave Joseph? The unfair advantage God gave David? The unfair advantage God gave Moses? What was the unfair advantage God gives us through the story on stewardship and the parable of the talents? That enables us to make the most of what he's given us? Simply put, it's grit. It's this thing called grit, this quality, this determination that's made up with gratitude and resilience and investment and teachability, that enables us to really live out and experience the blessing that's found through this principle of biblical stewardship. And look, I know there's probably someone who's tuning into this thinking to themselves, like, wait a second, Pastor. I thought you said that we're going to be talking about how to increase my net worth. And your answer is grits? Like that sounds an awful lot like work to me. That's not what I was expecting. For that matter, not really what I'm even looking for. Like, I thought you were going to give me like your favorite Bible verse and plus the date so that I can have 6 numbers to put in for my Powerball ticket. But to be clear, that's why I titled this message, not how to increase your net income, but how to increase your net worth. Because true wealth, how many know that lasts? That actually matters. I'm telling you, it actually takes work. Like true wealth, like heavenly reward, things that last for eternity. Listen, it takes some work. When we focus not on getting rich quick, but getting better over time. Let's check out what Proverbs 13:11, how it puts it. It says, wealth from get rich quick schemes quickly disappears. Wealth from hard work, though, grows over time. And in fact, we see this call to work what we've got, especially when it comes to making a kingdom difference and impact in this world. And we see it again in the parable of the talents. Matthew 25, verse 24 says, and then the man who received 1 bag of gold came. Master, he said, I knew that you're a hard man, harvesting where you had not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you. Now, in the past, when I would have preached on this, typically I would use a verse to challenge us to not be afraid to use your talents. And look, there's truth in that point, but here's the thing, that's actually not the point of the story. As the reality is, the point of this verse in particular isn't so much don't be afraid, as much as the point of this verse is don't make excuses. And here's how we know this, because of what the master says next to this man who simply buried what he was given. It says, his master replied, "You wicked, lazy servant. So you knew that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed." As notice, the master totally bypasses his fear as a reason, as a good excuse, and goes right at the excuses this guy was trying to make for not putting the work into what he had been given. In fact, might I add, for the same reasons, I think oftentimes so many of us tend to excuse ourselves from God's call in our lives. God's called to make a kingdom difference and impact in this world. To live not just for temporal wealth, but to live for the things that actually last for eternity. And as we maybe look at, and the part of the reason why we do this is because we look at what we do. We look at maybe the work we do, or we look at the job we do, and the tendency can be so easily to kind of discount what we have to offer, discount what we do, because we look, oh, really, what difference does that make? Like when I look at the job that I'm working, when I look at the thing I'm doing, like, what difference does it make? Because we think, catch this, we think somehow the value of our work is in what we do, when in reality, especially when it comes to increasing our net worth, making a kingdom impact, it's actually in how we do it. Check this out, Colossians 3, verse 23 says, "Work at whatever you do, as though you are working for the Lord rather than for people. Remember that the Lord will give you an inheritance as your reward, and that the master you are serving is Christ." As look, this might surprise some of you to hear, but while being a pastor is my job, being a pastor is actually not what I've been called to do. You know what I've actually, my calling is, what I've actually been called to do in this life, and might I add, you've been called to do in this life as well if you're a believer, a follower in Jesus? It's to preach. It's to preach. It's to share the story of what He's done in my life. It's to share the good news that has changed my life because of His amazing grace. 2 Timothy 4:2 speaks of this way. It says, "Preach the word and be prepared in season and out of season." I love that because it reminds me that, listen, even if my job changes, how many know my calling does not? Like, put me in Taco Bell and you're going to have a preacher in that Taco Bell. Put me in Starbucks, and look, you're going to have a barista who's going to find some way, somehow, to still preach and to share the good news of Jesus, right? Maybe even if that means like learning how to, draw a little cross on the froth of an espresso drink, right? Or write John 3:16 at the bottom of the cup. See, here's what I'm trying to get us to see is that you need to understand the limitations on our net worth, on our kingdom impact is not our occupation. For a lot of us, it's our application. As truth is, when it comes to what God takes notice of and celebrates at the end of our lives, it's not about what we do, it's how we do it and why, and more in particular, who we do it for. Who we do it for. Are we just doing it for ourselves? Or are we just doing it for a paycheck? Or are we doing it for Him? Doing it for Him. Matthew 25:19, in fact, we see this. This is after a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. And the man who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. "Master," he said, "you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I have gained 5 more." And then check this out. You're talking about true reward, lasting reward. Things that actually, listen, make a difference in light of eternity. Check out what the master says next. His master replied, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness." I love that term happiness because it reminds me of actually a verse in Hebrews where it says, in speaking of Jesus and how he was able to go to the cross and go through all this pain and go through all this suffering for you and for me. It says, for the joy set before him. Now, you know what that joy was? It wasn't to get to heaven. If the joy was simply to get to heaven, like, man, why even come down in the first place? No, the joy was at the potential and the possibility, because of his amazing grace, to see your face and my face with him for eternity. Listen, when the Bible talks about like building up treasure in heaven, this isn't about like building up some heavenly bank account or that somehow you're going to find yourself with a Mercedes-Benz when you get to heaven. Like, that'd be great, but that's probably not what's going to happen. No, the treasure and the reward it talks about are the people in our lives who, because you're willing to work what you have, willing to share the story. Maybe it didn't seem like that much or seem like you had that much to offer, but you just gave what you got and trusted God to work with what you have. Their lives were changed for eternity. Did they encounter the amazing grace of our God? And as a result, the joy set not just before him, the joy set before us is again seeing that the face of that lost neighbor, or that hopeless coworker, or that discouraged friend who, again, God used you and worked through you, maybe through an invite or something that seems so small and seems so little, to get a hold of their heart, to change their life by leading them to this encounter with our living God, leading to this place of repentance and conviction, to this place of surrender, where asking Jesus to come into their life, discover through this relationship with Jesus, not just life eternal, but life abundant. Look, I want to pray for us, and again, I want to encourage you. Maybe you look at what you have in this life, and again, it can be so easy to get focused on what we don't have. If we're not careful, we can lose sight of what we do have. And look what we do have. I'm telling you, if what you have is Jesus, is more than enough to make the most of this one and only life. Not just in terms of the joy we find in him, not just in terms of the peace we find in him, but I'm telling you the purpose we find in him as well. When we take what we have and we put the work into it, trusting him to work with what we've got. Listen, I'm telling you, just watch what God will do with a little bit of time, a little bit of effort, a little invite, a little offer to pray for somebody. And just watch how he grows our net worth in terms of kingdom impact, of seeing lives of those we so care about and maybe been praying about and praying for. And talk about joy and talk about happiness and talk about celebration. Listen, I'm telling you, there's nothing more thrilling than seeing that person you've been praying for finally make that decision to surrender it all to him. In fact, listen, maybe you're the person that's on the other side of that right now watching this. And could it be that maybe, just maybe, God actually brought you here, got you tuning in to share with you that what you have, listen, even if it feels like what you have is nothing, listen, it's more than enough for God to do a transforming, saving work in your life when you're willing to simply surrender all that you've got to the one who gave it all for you. And look, the way you do that is by simply having the heart of surrender. It says, God, I recognize I've made more than a few mistakes. I've made more than a few wrong turns, but I believe you love me enough to leave heaven, to come to earth, to die on a cross, to pay a price in full for not just some of my sin and not just some of my shame, but all my sin and shame, past, present, future. Because of which, Jesus, I'm asking you to come into my life and to be the Lord and Savior of my life. I'm giving it all to you, Jesus. I'm not just living for some temporal happiness. I want to live now for the joy that's set before me. The joy of you, Jesus. Of eternity with you, Jesus. God, we give all this over to you. In Jesus' name.